Hugh Stein, are you with us?
I am with you.
All right, great. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Well, technology never fails, remember?
That's right. That's right. So, hey, welcome back to Late Night in the Midlands. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I was just reading off to people about the 450 nuclear reactors in the world and 104 of them in the United States. And the question on whether all these could fail at one time, and even if they failed at different times, would it really matter? We'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't we?
Oh, yeah, we'd be in a deep pile of it'd be very serious trouble. If even a significant percentage of them failed at all, at roughly the same time, we'd be in big trouble. I mean, you're talking multiple Fukushima-like events happening all over. Mostly in the northern hemisphere. There's a few in Argentina, and a few in India, but the vast majority of these are in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, we've got quite a few of them here in South Carolina, from what I understand.
Yeah. When you look at the map of the United States and where the nuclear facilities are, Georgia, South Carolina, pretty dense over there. Don't know why you guys like them so much.
I don't know. I moved here from New York, and so I've never been a fan of these things. And when I found out, I don't know, probably a year ago, how many we had here, it was quite a few. I can't think off the top of my head. I think it was something, I don't know if it was somewhere around 30 of them. If there's that many over this way, that is a huge, huge concern. Huge concern. There's a big fault line that comes through Charleston and parts of Columbia, too.
Yeah, you guys have the New Madrid fault out there, the biggest fault in North America, pretty much. But it doesn't go off that often. But when it does, it has gone off in a big way. And so there'd be probably a dozen, anywhere from a few to a dozen nuclear power plants if the New Madrid went off in a big way.
So what are we talking here? Let's talk about Fukushima first. How serious is this, and is the dangers worldwide, as I believe them to be? But I'm no expert on this stuff. I go by what the research people send me. So, how serious are we talking here?
Well, you are talking very serious situation, and the precarious situation at Fukushima is, certainly it's bad enough what's inside the two reactor cores, 3 and 4, that had full meltdowns and blew their containment vessels, so they're leaking, out to the environment, the outside environment. But on top of that, most people don't realize that these nuclear reactor fuel doesn't last all that long. So every, couple years or so, they have to unload the reactor fuel rods and put fresh fuel rods in. Now, when they take those rods out, they're extremely hot physically and extremely hot radioactively. In fact, they're so hot that you can't get near them in a radiation suit. And they have these giant cranes that are built in part of the reactor mechanism as a way to load and unload these extremely radioactive fuel rods. So they have these giant cranes with mechanical linkages that can go down and reach inside a reactor and grip the fuel rods and pull them up and load them into this kind of like a little doughboy swimming pool on cables. And so they have this giant tank of water, and the rods are so radioactive that putting them in the water that soaks up the neutrons, and so the radioactivity is not so bad, so you can be around it like in a radiation suit when it's all buried in the water. And whereas you die even through the radiation suit if it didn't have that water around it. So then the crane lifts it up in this big bucket of water and moves over. It's like an industrial crane on rails. So it lifts them up and then it slides sideways on rails. And then it goes to what's called a spent fuel pond pool, which is like a big giant swimming pool. It's 25 feet deep. And it takes these rods down and then unloads them with the mechanical linkages under the water and loads the rods onto specially designed racks so that they keep the rods from getting too close to each other and going critical. Even buried under 25 feet of water, they still have to be handled really carefully. And they can't be handled. They're so radioactive that electronic components fail near them. So they have to be all done with like mechanical linkages, not little electronic robots, because it would zap the. Not only would it kill people, it would also kill the electronic robots. So, so in Fukushima, on top of these blown up buildings, and everyone saw the pictures of the buildings blowing their tops, are these two swimming pools called spent fuel ponds, filled with, each of them have roughly 10 Chernobyls worth of radioactive material in the pond. So you figure there's a Chernobyl worth of radioactive material in each of the reactor cores, and they've blown their tops, and they're still need to be cooled continuously, or they'll still melt down and cause even more damage, China syndrome kind of stuff. But on top of that, you have these buildings that have been kind of blown to pieces like a bomb hit them, and the roofs are sort of blown off. And on top of these buildings, then, there's these pools of water just filled with debris. All of the machinery, that really expensive, cool, high-tech stuff that was designed to unload those fuel rods and load fresh rods in, that's all blown to pieces, and it's lying inside the spent fuel ponds and all around them. So here you've got these 4-story tall buildings that have big holes blown through them all over, that look like they're on their last legs, they're barely standing up. They're in a seismically active zone. And on top of these buildings, they have, the upper story has the roof blown off, and there's this pool full of wreckage and debris, and inside the wreckage and debris is also 10 Chernobyls worth of rods just sitting there. So you say, well, okay, so what? You know, they're like spent fuel rods, right? You know, they're not so bad because they've already been used. Well, no. It turns out that you have to keep these rods cool for 3 to 5 years after you take them out of the reactor. They're still so hot that if you lose cooling, then they can start to melt. They can start to melt down and burn, even if they're not in a reactor core, just sitting out there in the pond. So these ponds, if they're left untended, will boil dry. And one of the reasons you saw in Fukushima, you saw these like, you may or may not have seen, but they had these big tanker trucks like with huge fire hoses blowing water up on top of the buildings. Well,
yeah,
they weren't blowing water on top of the buildings to keep the reactor cool because they couldn't get inside the reactor with that water. They're blowing water on top of the buildings to keep the spent fuel ponds cool. Because see, a spent fuel pond will boil itself dry in between 3 days and 22 days, depending on how recently, you know, if they're not replenished with cooling water. They'll boil dry, and then they'll start to burn. See, these things get so hot. Each of these fuel rods is encased in something called zirconium because regular steel just doesn't cut it in this highly radioactive environment. It would get brittle and fall apart and fall to pieces. So they have them encased in a metal called zirconium, which, you know, I never really heard of before I talked to some nuclear engineers about Fukushima. And it turns out that zirconium is like really, really tough when it comes to radioactivity. It can handle it much better than steel can. But if it gets too hot, it starts burning like a Roman candle. It's just like, you ever burn magnesium foil in a chem lab in high school? You ever see that happen?
Have.
Yeah, it's pretty bright, huh? I mean, pretty amazing that metal burns so bright. I mean, it's like you got to shield your eyes. You burn your eyes. You see spots in front of your eyes if you don't shield them or squint or, you know, turn away or look through really dark glasses. So this zirconium burns just like magnesium when it gets really hot, and it'll keep burning. So if these fuel ponds boil dry, then you've got a situation, or if they run dry, like an earthquake happens and they fall apart, or they sprout leaks and they lose all their water, then shortly after that, you know, within a few hours, these fuel rods will start like overheating and burning off like radioactive Roman candles. And then you have not just one, but like 10 Chernobyls worth of radioactive burning going on in each of the two spent fuel ponds. There's about 60 Chernobyls worth of material in Fukushima. So if the whole site went up, you know, you're talking like 50, 60 Chernobyls worth of radioactive material that could theoretically get out in the environment. But certainly the two big concerns, those fuel ponds. Now, you say, well, how bad is it? Well, if you Google Washington's blog, like George Washington with an S on there, Washington's blog, Spent Fuel Ponds, you get a visual tour of the spent fuel ponds in Fukushima, and it's mind-blowing. I mean, it's really, really scary stuff because you see how bad it really is. It's like, whoa, why is not the regular media showing me this? I mean, this is like
I understand one of them
serious.
sinking.
That's what people are saying. That's what people are saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been hearing that, but I haven't spent the time to verify and follow up on it. I know it's a huge problem, sinking or not. It's like a 3 to 5 year program to develop all of the new high-tech equipment and robots that can handle the radiation to really go in and start doing the demolition and dismantling job of taking the debris out and getting all those rods out of the ponds. That's what they're saying, at least. So they're talking like a 5 to 10 year plan to unload the crap out of those ponds. The question is, well, you know, they're probably gone already a year into that plan now, so say it's 4 to 9 years. Will those fuel ponds be still standing in how many years? Will they still be full of water and still standing? And if they lose their water, whether it's from an earthquake or because they burn a hole in the bottom of the pond, or, you know, the one you're talking about that's sinking, whatever reason it's sinking, that it sinks in such a way that it spills all the water out of that pond, you know, chances that it'll still be, you know, viable and underwater in 10 years from now. And of course, it's only underwater because they keep filling it with fire hoses. But
right.
You know, it's not like there's a water supply that automatically fills itself up. It's got to be filled with, like, you know, big pumping trucks and fire hoses right now. So you're talking a serious situation. Now backtracking to Chernobyl. When Chernobyl burned, there was like the Chernobyl 200, where roughly a couple hundred people basically volunteered to get lethal or near lethal doses of radiation in order to save their country. And so those people, some of them survived, most of them died. You know, some of them died very short-term deaths, like within the following week or two, and some died in the next few months, and others died over the next 10 years, and a few of them are still alive, but like totally disabled and really, really sick. But then they figured officially like 10,000 people died from Chernobyl, but the epistemological study done in the in Russia, Soviet Union's gone, but in Russia they did a recent study released like a year or two ago, and they found that from, you know, looking at like deaths and types of deaths, you know, and death rates and in the years before Fukushima versus after, they found that since since Chernobyl, roughly 1 million people died in early yucky death from cancer and tumors and various illnesses caused by Chernobyl, and 3 million people have been sickened and led, you know, very sick, unhealthy lives because of Chernobyl. Now that's just one Chernobyl's worth of radioactivity, and here you're talking between the two spent fuel ponds, like 20 Chernobyl's worth, and in the whole site there, like 50 Chernobyl's worth. So you're talking serious amounts of radiation. Now, how about in the United States? Well, we got 90-plus spent fuel ponds in the United States. We don't use the dry cask storage system because it's very expensive that they use in Japan. When the rods, after 3 to 5 years, the rod's cool enough, they can be placed into specially designed dry casks that will store them for like thousands of years, and they allow for heat transfer to the air so they don't overheat, and they space them out in such a way that they don't go critical, they're too close to each other. You know, there's a lot of considerations in these things that nuclear engineers understand much better than you or I. But they're really expensive. They're like $1 million for each little dry cask, and I'm not sure, you know, how many rods they store in them, but it costs a lot. So in the United States, we don't use dry casks. We just keep them in the pools. So what do we have? We've got like 90-plus ponds, average of 15 Chernobyl's worth of radioactive material in each one of those ponds. We have no permanent storage facility. They're working on one in Finland. And I saw this movie, I think it's called From Here to Eternity. You can Google it, and there's a film clip on it. Very, very interesting. And there's a workman there, hard hat guy, and he says that he's been working on this facility for years, and that his father before him worked on it, and it won't be done until his children's generation finishes it. And it's a facility designed like 10,000 feet, you know, some huge number of feet down in bedrock, and it's designed to last for 100,000 years. because that's how long this stuff is dangerous for. Now, the Great Pyramids are less than 10,000 years old. So this is a facility being designed to store spent fuel rods for more than 10 times the period of time that the Great Pyramids have been around. Imagine that.
Amazing.
And it takes 3 generations of people to build this facility. I mean,
now,
that's the kind of stuff we got.
Don't you think that, I know that you would agree, it would have made sense to make the equipment and the facilities they needed before they put us in so much danger? Wouldn't that have been a really good and smooth idea?
Well, you know, but remember, they're smart guys, and like talking with Arnie Gunderson. Arnie Gunderson is has a Master of Science in Nuclear Engineering from RPI, and he was #1 in his class, and he was Senior Technical Vice President of Nuclear Energy Services in Danbury, Connecticut, before he became a nuclear whistleblower. And kind of when I asked that sort of question to him, he said, you know, Matt, the numbers are so seductive. It's like nuclear energy puts out such great amounts of heat and power. It's just so seductive. And as engineers, you tend to think, you know, we can solve this. We can solve all these problems. You know, we can, the numbers are so good for how much energy it puts out that, you know, we've just got to do it, and I know we'll solve these problems. It's that kind of can-do attitude. But it's that sort of can-do attitude that got us in this problem in the first place and got us in the nuclear missile arms race and all kinds of things. So, yeah, what you're saying makes sense, but, you know, it's that can-do attitude, like we're engineers and we're scientists and we can solve everything if we put our minds to it, that, you know, it tends to be that overconfidence that, yeah, you know, we can make it really safe and make sure nothing ever happens. And it's like, oh, yeah, like 3 Mile Island didn't happen, and Chernobyl didn't happen, and Fukushima didn't happen. And that's ignoring the threat to our long-term grid collapse that we're still ignoring. It's still that can-do positive attitude of like, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be okay kind of thing. And do you want to head there now, or do you want to ask me a couple other questions first?
Well, I have a question about Chernobyl. Now, when you say that 1 million or more people became ill, are we talking about people around the world or just within the Soviet Union?
We're talking about people primarily in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's not just, it's the Ukraine, it's Belarus, you know, a lot of ex-states of the Soviet Union. But it even includes looking at, you know, other places in Europe that got lower doses and comparing, like, the cancer and tumor rates and, you know, before Chernobyl and after Chernobyl, and in these areas that did receive some downwind doses versus areas that didn't. So I'm not, you know, totally up on all the scientific rigor, but it was a study that was done under very, you know, very rigorous standards, and so I believe the figures from the study of 1 million people died worldwide, and it was more like 100,000 people locally, and a million in areas a little further away, and 3 million people sickened, you know, given long-term serious health problems because of it. So if there's a quote that I have in, let me see if I can find it in my book, When Disaster Strikes. Hang on a second.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a very serious quote, and it starts my chapter on surviving a nuclear catastrophe, which I finished writing. The chapter's called The Unthinkable, Chapter 17 in When Disaster Strikes, and I finished writing it 3 days before Fukushima. And then 2 weeks earlier, I finished writing a chapter on EMP and electromagnetic pulses and solar storms just before that. And it took actually a high school graduate caller to point out to me that I need to draw the lines between the two chapters, that there was a very significant connection that we'll get into shortly. But here's a quote that is so, I don't know, it's kind of long, but I'll start it out and then maybe stop a little bit. It says, 5 years ago, this is by John Vidal, and the title is from an article called Nuclear's Green Cheerleaders Forget Chernobyl at Our Peril, published in the Guardian UK magazine. And here it starts. It says, 5 years ago, I visited the still highly contaminated areas of Ukraine and the Belarus border, where much of the radioactive plume from Chernobyl descended on the 26th of April, 1986. I challenged Chief Scientist John Beddington and environmentalists like George Monibot, or any of the pundits now downplaying the risks of radiation, to talk to the doctors, the scientists, the mothers, the children, and the villagers who've been left with the consequences of a major nuclear accident. It was grim. We went from hospital to hospital, and from one contaminated village to another. We found deformed and genetically mutated babies in the wards, pitifully sick children in the homes, adolescents with stunted growth and dwarfed torsos, fetuses without thighs or fingers, and villagers who told us every member of their family was sick. This is 20 years after the accident, but we heard of many unusual clusters of people with rare bone cancers. One doctor, in tears, told us that 1 in 3 pregnancies in some places were malformed, and that she was overwhelmed by people with immune and endocrine system disorders. Others said they still saw cesium and strontium in the breast milk of mothers living far from the areas thought to be most affected, and significant radiation is still in the food chain 20 years later. Villagers testified that the, quote, Chernobyl necklace, which is thyroid cancer, tumors around the throat, was so common as to be unremarkable, and many showed signs of accelerated aging. So this is like, okay, and here it says, the study published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences that 985,000 people had died so far, and the environment had been devastated. And their study and findings were met with almost complete silence by the World Health Organization and industry. So this is serious. This is huge, and we're living with it. And as we go further, you'll see that it's not just in somebody else's backyard, it's in our backyard. You see, 37% of all Americans live within 50 miles of a nuclear reactor. And the reason is that these power plants make a huge amount of energy. And when you transmit huge amounts of energy over long distances, there's transmission losses. So that's like money down the drain. That's like flushing, millions of dollars down the toilet. So they build these things not so close to cities that people get really nervous and worried about it, but they build them close enough so that they don't, have a lot of transmission losses. So as a result, more than 1 out of 3 Americans lives within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant.
Amazing. Amazing. So now with Fukushima, I get reports from people all the time, and some think it's paranoid. I don't know, but I get reports saying that this Fukushima disaster could be catastrophic worldwide.
Well, it could be. I see it. I mean, it is catastrophic. And people have said, like Annie Grundyson and Helen Caldicott, who is founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility in the anti-nuclear movement. She founded that back in the 70s or 80s. And, it was 70s. And they both said, well, if the spent fuel ponds go, I'm getting a ticket, one-way ticket to the Southern Hemisphere. Now, I personally believe that just like the Chernobyl 200 that gave their lives to take either lethal or near-lethal doses of radiation while they were dumping, millions of tons of concrete and rock and earth on top of Chernobyl to make the quote, sarcophagus to encase it, that I believe that there's hundreds of similar nuclear industry workers who volunteered for suicide mission work in Japan. Because if the spent fuel ponds go, then, what? You're going to evacuate all of Japan? Where are you going to put 15 million people from the greater Tokyo area? I do know that they've been negotiating with some island with the Soviet Union where they could move a large part of the population, but, try to do it. I mean, so they're serious enough and worried enough they're negotiating about it, but to actually, it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to actually do it. So I don't see how they'll have any choice but to use as many kamikaze suicide people as they need to encase it like they did in Chernobyl. But to me it's a giant wake-up call. And let me tell you let me shift gears and I'll talk a little bit about the connections and why it's such a significant likelihood that it could happen here. See, according to the official line, the nuclear power plants didn't melt down directly because of the earthquake damage. The earthquake shut down the grid locally. And you see, when a nuclear power plant is designed that when there's a big grid anomaly, like the grid crashes or it's got huge problems, then it automatically disconnects from the grid and it goes into emergency shutdown mode. Now, you can't just shut down a nuclear power plant like flipping a light switch. They're designed that when the grid goes down, the fuel rods, the control rods, gravity feed drop in between the fuel rods and start slowing the reaction down. But it's just slowing it down exponentially, which means it slows it down quickly. But according to Gunderson, like 9 months after Fukushima, if they lost cooling water in the cores in only 33 hours, they would melt down again, which means that even though they're much cooler than they were, instead of melting down in 15 minutes, now they melt down like 33 hours. So these rods gets cooled down slowly. So Fukushima happens, the earthquake happens, and the grid collapses. And each of those, there was 4 out of the 6 nuclear power plants were still operating at the time. 2 of them were unloaded with fuel, so they weren't operational. So there was only 4 out of the 6 were operational. Well, the tsunami comes along, and it wipes out the backup generators and battery banks that kept the pumps running to keep the cores cooled when they disconnected from the grid and went into shutdown mode. So the reactors number 3 and 4 were operating, and the generators got wiped out. And so like 15 minutes later, they started melting down, and 2 hours later, they started blowing their tops. And reactor number 5 and number 6, well, number 6 actually had a generator on the uphill side of the power plant. Brilliant idea. Here you're in an area where you're prone to earthquakes, and there's cave paintings showing ancient tsunamis that, the guys who lived in the caves made paintings about tsunamis, and they built nuclear power plants right there, and they put their backup generators on the ocean side of the power plants where they were, totally unprotected from tsunamis. So now number 5 is starting to melt down, and the workers were able to get power shunted from the backup generators at number 6 over to number 5. So that's the only reason that number 5 didn't totally melt down like 3 and 4 did, was because they were able to get a cable run from the one remaining backup generator that wasn't wiped out by the tsunami over to number 5, and that's what kept number 5 from going totally melted down like 3 and 4 did. Pretty serious stuff. Now, when I was on the radio show back when Fukushima happened, part of the show I started talking about solar storms and EMPs, electromagnetic pulses, and how they could provide really long-term grid failure, in which case, oil wouldn't be refined, pumps wouldn't be working, infrastructure would collapse, people would be starving, there'd be chaos and riots in the street, governments would fall, stock markets would fall, all that good stuff. And a caller said, well, Mr. Stein, how long do they have backup fuel at these power plants? Well, they're mandated to have a week's worth of fuel on hand. And it's like, well, you're talking like months to years with the grid down and things not working and fuel deliveries not happening. What's going to happen to those power plants? And it's like, oh, God. Here I wrote these 2 chapters 2 weeks apart, and it took someone calling in to connect the dots between EMPs and solar storm and nuclear meltdown and nuclear Armageddon. And he was right. And since then I've had operators call me up and say, well, even though the Nuclear Regulatory Commission mandates only a week's worth of fuel on hand, well, we have a month on hand. Well, okay, you got a month on hand. The grid's down for 6 months, 9 months, 2 years. That month on hand is still going to run out.
And the mainstream media would be glowing in the dark on TV and still tell you everything's okay.
No, they'd be totally shut down right off the bat because they're going to lose backup power shortly after an EMP or solar storm strike, and they're going to be totally blanked out just like everybody else. So they'll be in the dark like everybody, like a mushroom, Only the mainstream media won't be feeding the bull to everybody else, because they'll be just as blacked out and clueless as the other people, because they won't really have a clue what's going on. So let's talk about, unless you want to go somewhere else, about solar storms and EMP and why they would cause the grid to go down for so long. Is that where you want to go? Or?
Sure. Let's take a break here quick, because we're up on our break, and when we come, what do you expect the outcome to be in the days, months, and even years that could follow with this?
Well, yeah, that's a big question, a $1 million question. It's actually guaranteed that a major solar event, which if there are no protective measures put into our grid, in other words, if the grid continues in its current form without protective measures, and they've invented the stuff to protect it, they're just not doing it. I'll get into that. That's a separate question I'll get in. Like, if they have the stuff, why aren't they doing it? Let's get into that later.
Okay.
But we've had about 100 major solar storms in the last 150 years. 2 of those in the last 150 years have been classified as extreme geomagnetic disturbances, extreme GMDs. So, for instance, like last spring, you might have remembered that they had some really great pictures of northern lights, and they had to reroute some flights of the North Pole, and it disrupted a little bit of communications. But for the most part, other than really cool pictures on the internet, it was like no big deal. So that's called like a strong solar storm. In 1989, they had a very strong storm, and it wiped out a massive power transformer in Quebec, Hydro-Quebec. Now, these transformers interconnect our grid. They're what allows us to send like megawatts of power long distances fairly efficiently. They step the voltage up to between 350,000 volts. I mean, we have like 110 volts at home, or really high voltage is 220. Well, these transformers step it up to 350,000 at the low end to 1 million volts at the upper end, like really, really high voltage. And then they transmit this over power lines, the big giant towers that are spaced far apart, long distances, and at the other end, another transformer steps it down from 350,000 or 1 million, whatever they're operating at, down to a usable, voltage for running around your town or your city. Now, the problem is that we have 180,000 miles of high voltage lines connecting these massive transformers. So when you have a huge solar storm, it's like the upper atmosphere. What happens is the sun sort of burps, and massive stuff, sun stuff, goes flying off through space at like millions of miles an hour, between hundreds of thousands and millions of miles an hour, like way faster than rockets fly. And most of the time it's no big deal. It's called a coronal mass ejection. It just kind of goes out into space. Space is a really big place, and most of the time it doesn't come anywhere near Earth. And now and then it hits the Earth or gives us a glancing blow, and we get really cool northern and southern lights, aurora borealis, and, we maybe get some disrupted communications, but no big deal. Well, in 1989, it was big enough that it fried one of these giant transformers that are 300 tons each, tens of millions of dollars each. They're custom made and custom designed, custom built for each location, and there's now a 3-year waiting list to get one. So one fried in Quebec, one fried in the Northeast, like New Jersey or someplace in the Northeast, and one fried in the UK. Well, they managed to keep the grid going in the Northeast and in the UK, and they had a big grid collapse for, like 6 to 9 hours, and some people for a couple of days in parts of Canada, but it wasn't the end of the world. Well, in 2003, they had a similar event that for some reason really nailed South Africa, and it burned 14 of those power transformers. And the only way they could compensate, because it's like these are tens of millions of dollars each, custom made. You don't just have a bunch sitting on hand. You don't go to the hardware store and buy one. So the only way they could compensate in South Africa was to have rolling blackouts for like an entire year while they, placed orders and rushed to get 14 of these made to replace them. And so imagine trying to do work if any 2 or 3 days out of the week you come to work and, all of a sudden the power goes out in the middle of the day and doesn't come back on until night. Your refrigerators are out of power, your lights, your air conditioners, your elevators, and there's no backup generators anywhere in the country to be found because all the generators got scarfed up like in the first few hours of the blackout. And so if you didn't manage to get in the line first, then you were SOL. Okay, now, 1921, extreme geomagnetic event. 10 times stronger than the one that fried the 3 in Northern Hemisphere, and more than 10 times stronger than the one that nailed South Africa in 2003. So what would that do? Well, back then, backpedal, the sky lit up like blood red, orange, gold streaks, green, fluorescent green sky from the North Pole all the way down to Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and from the South Pole all the way to Samoa, like no one you know has ever seen before in their life. 2 days and nights this was lit up the sky, and it caused Penn Central Station burned down because of induced currents, just burned Penn Central down, and a bunch of like telegraph places and communications got burned down. But life went on. There was no 180,000 miles of interconnected grid. It didn't exist. It was just individual electrified cities. It caused some problems, but not a big deal. So the government said, well, this is a serious issue. They said, 14 of these transformers blown in South Africa, 3 blown in the 1989 event. This could be a problem. So they hired Meditech Corporation under the Oak Ridge National Labs and overseen by Sandia National Labs to study this phenomenon, to say, okay, if we had a 1921 size storm, which was by some estimates 50% weaker than the 1859 Carrington event that went on for an entire week. That was like a 1-2 blast. They had one CME got the atmosphere revving up in the world and lit up the skies just like the 1921 event. And then 2 days later, another CME launched off the sun, direct hit on the planet, and it like got the upper atmosphere electromagnetically revved up again. So for an entire week it went on, and it's supposedly 50% stronger than the 1921 event. So they said, okay, let's model this 1921 event. Super smart scientists, bunch of PhDs, physicist guys looking at this. The model and computer models indicate 350 plus of these transformers blowing in the United States alone, a couple thousand probably in the world. That's like 10 to 20 years of manufacturing capacity to make those. If every place in the world that made those transformers today was working at capacity, they could replace all those in between 10 and 20 years time. Now, but the thing is that if one of these things hits and fries these transformers, most of the industrial world, except for the deep tropical zones, will be totally out of commission. So you'd be relying on like India and Malaysia and Singapore to come to the rescue, to be the cavalry to come to the rescue and fix the rest of the world. So what are we looking at? You're looking at grid going down. First thing that happens, instantly, the lights go off. The lights go off and, no switches work. Money machines stop working. You can't pump gas, can't buy anything at the store, can't do any of that. That happens instantly. 3 hours later, the cell phones lose their backup charge, in most of the cell phone relay stations. So your cell phones crap out after about 3 hours. 3 days later, the central telephone switching stations lose their backup battery and power supplies. So the landline phones and if you've got a phone that plugs into your wall, it stops working immediately. But if you have an old style phone, which I keep around for emergencies, that just plugs into the jack, doesn't need a wall transformer, those would crap out in 3 days. The sewage pumps. You're in a big city. When you poop and flush the toilet, it doesn't just happen automatically. There's giant sewage pumps and pumping stations that keep that sewage from the big city moving to the sewage plants. Those stop working immediately. The water pumps and the water treatment plants, they'll stop working immediately. The natural gas lines. Well, it used to be that natural gas lines had booster pumps every so many miles. And they actually used natural gas as the fuel to drive the pumps to keep the pressure up and to keep the natural gas flowing in the lines. Well, it turns out that electric pumps are like cheaper and more efficient and more reliable. Well, so long as they got electricity. But, when the grid goes down, those brand new shiny electric booster pumps in the natural gas lines, they stop working too. So once you start, if you've got a city that's got water towers, the water pressure will keep going until the city, uses the water in the water towers and there's no pumps to replenish it, and then your water stops coming out of your faucet. So you're looking at all of that stuff just, day after day after day, everything getting worse and worse and worse. Just like in Hurricane Katrina, the infrastructure just collapsed and got worse day by day by day around Katrina. Hospitals ran out of backup fuel, central switching stations and phones ran out of backup power. Everything just fell apart, and then it had to be restarted from the outside. But Hurricane Katrina was a relatively small area on the scale of things. You're talking now most of North America, most of Europe, most of the southern hemisphere, most of the industrialized places in the world just, shutting down for a long period of time. Now, small, rural, isolated places that have their own power generation things like hydroelectric and, natural gas or coal plants, they may be able to get themselves disconnected from the grid. It's extremely hard to restart when there's no part of the grid going to restart from. But, some really good engineers and ingenious, MacGyver types might be able to restart some parts. But the big areas that rely on lots of power and have to have those massive transformers, they're pretty much toast. Now, a place like Texas might be the best place to be because it's far enough south. They won't lose too many of those big transformers. Because, think about a magnet. Like if you have a north and south pole in the magnet and you dip it in sand and get iron filings, the filings stick on the north pole and the south pole, not in the middle. So the magnetic fields kind of balance each other out in the middle. So when these charged particles from the sun hit the planet, they interact with the magnetic field at the north and south pole and don't do that much around the equator. So that's why the central tropical zones are relatively unscathed compared to the further north or further south zones. So now
this would potentially become a kind of a martial law scenario, wouldn't it?
Well, except who's going to be controlling martial law? I mean, this is like beyond martial law. This is more like that TV show Revolution, which has some hokey parts, but it's kind of actually a lot worse than Revolution in many respects. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the show or not. People said, well, you got to see it, Matt, because it pertains to what you talk about. So I've taped some sessions, and I'm not caught up, but I've seen 2 or 3 of them, enough to know what's going on. And this is like beyond martial law. This is like collapse of the military, collapse of the government, collapse of the stock market. This is like really huge. Like, who's in control when it comes back together, and what does it take to get it back together, and how many people have survived in the meantime before it gets back together? And this is where doing your best to be mentally and physically prepared to cope with. I mean, this is a really bad scenario. And so, naturally, I would rather, because there's a relatively cheap fix, there's no way to prevent all bad things from happening from an extreme geomagnetic event like that. There's going to be a lot of electrical stuff that's blown out, though it's primarily grid-related stuff. It doesn't have the pulse like an electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon affects lots of electronics, particularly digital electronics, whereas the solar one really doesn't. It's more like it's a long, slow burn that fries the grid stuff that keeps things going. It doesn't really fry your smaller electronics and your digital stuff like an EMP does. So they're similar but not the same kind of thing. And so we'll get into the EMP more in a few minutes. But it's a question of what of our existing society will survive. And there will be a lot of what they call yo-yo time, which is you're on your own time. Where think about Hurricane Katrina and how slow the government was in getting the cavalry to come in and help out. Now think about 70 Katrinas happening at once across the country, and think about most of the country being infrastructure collapse just like Katrina. In fact, they did a study. I know some guys who were in part of a war college symposium where they invited first responders and military guys, and these are like the guys who are, at the top of their game in dealing with disaster kind of things. And when they did the tabletop scenario about the extent of the collapse of infrastructure from a solar storm, all these guys basically admitted, there'll be so little communication from the top and so much chaos at the bottom that I just don't see how we're not going to be going home to do the best to fend for our family and our friends, and because there's very little we'll be able to do without an infrastructure, without a grid and communication.
Right.
Because
you got to think about it. There'd be computers would be out, and it'd be a matter of time before police cars couldn't fill up with gas either. And
that's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. So it would get. And what I worry about is those nuclear power plants. Don't they need electricity?
Well, they need that fuel. And right now the government's promised that in the event of a long-term grid down situation that they will deliver trucks of diesel fuel to nuclear power plants. Because, see, they're mandated to keep a 1-week supply of fuel on hand. And, America, let's face it, we have a very stable grid, and the grid's never down for more than a day or two at a time in any part of the country, right? Well, yeah. Except that we've never had an extreme geomagnetic event since we've had a grid, and we've never had an electromagnetic pulse in the United States since we had a grid. So those are two big scenarios. Now, back in 2010 or so, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation teamed up with the Department of Homeland Security, and they sponsored a conference called the High Impact Low Frequency, and the conference invited people together to discuss these so-called black swan events, like high-impact, low-frequency events, or HILF, H-I-L-F events. These are things that don't happen very often, but if they do happen, they're like huge impact. And so they looked at things like pandemics, and they looked at things like cyber attack, and they looked at things like EMPs and solar storms, and some other scenarios that I don't recall off the top of my head. And their conclusion was that out of all of these, the two that are most worrisome, because they're actually quite likely to happen, is both solar storms, extreme solar storms, and EMP. And their conclusion was that we must do something, because this is like a giant disaster, horrendous disaster, end of the world as we know it, not necessarily the end of life on the planet Earth, but end of, in other words, if things get pulled back together again and the pieces get put back together again, the world at that point in time won't look anything like the world looks like today. And that's a question of if, like how long will it take to put the pieces back together again when Humpty Dumpty's fallen off the wall? And so, it's a big question. So what happens? Well, it turns out that they've invented some new material. It's like giant vacuum tubes that operate in nanoseconds, like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a blink of an eye, to switch massive amounts of currents and volts around these transformers in the event of either an EMP or an extreme geomagnetic solar storm. And so these would cost estimates about $1 billion to protect our grid from frying and collapsing in the event of either of those two game-changing events, solar storm or EMP. So that's $1 billion. That's half the price of a B-2 bomber. Official estimates of the bailout in Wall Street is over $500 billion. Unofficial estimates are like $16 to $17 billion in special loans to prevent like meltdown of the financial world. So here we have, hundreds to thousands of times as much money as we're talking about to protect our grid from totally collapsing and frying the infrastructure and the end of the United States as we know it and the end of the stock market as we know it and all of those things and potentially nuclear Armageddon. And for like another $1 billion, which would totally, combined, were equal to $2 billion, which is like the price of a single stealth bomber, and we got 23 of those things. For another $1 billion, we could provide a year's worth of backup fuel in EMP-hardened containers at each nuclear power plant to guarantee that we have critical components and backup generators and backup fuel for at least a year at each of our power plants. I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. Now, so what happens? Well, NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, sounds really fancy. Sounds like these guys are the good guys, are out there to make sure our grid is reliable. Well, they co-sponsored that HILF report, and they said, this is really scary, and we've got to do something about it. So what happens next? Well, NERC is run, it's kind of Fox's Garden, the chicken coops. It's a private corporation, but funded by industry, and the industry basically runs it. And there's this bill in Congress called the SHIELD Act, and the SHIELD Act says, you guys got to fix this grid. We got to protect the grid from cyber attack and from EMP and solar storm. We got to protect it. So you guys have to go out and spend that $1 billion out of your pocket, out of that bottom line, $1 billion out off of your profit margin. And if after a couple of years you haven't been able to make the money back from, charging your constituents more money, then you can petition the government and we'll think about like reimbursing you. So what does NERC do? Well, they kind of fire those guys who wrote the HILF report, and they get some more guys in there, and they come out with they pay a bunch of lobbyists to go to Congress and say, it ain't that bad, don't worry about it, everything's okay, you don't need that SHIELD Act. And then they come out with a new report, and they get it all over the news, and it says, everything's okay. We have adequate safeguards in our grid right now to protect it. In the event of a solar storm, the grid will just simply collapse on itself, and we'll restart it, and it'll protect itself because it'll be shut down and collapsed, and everything's okay. And I believe in the Tooth Fairy and Fairy Godmother and Santa Claus. And it's like, well, what new science have you done? What new studies have you done? Oh, nothing. What about the Meditech Corporation study? I understand Sandia National Labs and Oak Ridge National Labs. Those are some pretty big guns. What about that? Well, Meditech is a private company, and they didn't share their code that they use to do the digital modeling of our grid. So we believe that further study is mandated, and before we take any kind of drastic steps and take that $1 billion out of our bottom line. So, we're not saying that we don't believe them, but we can't understand it. We don't have the access to the code. So let's just study the problem some more. That's kind of like those engineers who said for 50 years that the levees around New Orleans was a disaster waiting to happen. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And they basically said, you get a major hurricane hitting New Orleans, and much of the city is toast. Those levees can't handle it. Well, the government, some of the people listened. They eventually approved the money to fix the levees. But, fixing something that ain't broke, don't fix it, wasn't very sexy. So the politicians decided to put the money in something else, like really necessary. I don't know, maybe it was a new sports arena or something, who knows, but they put the money somewhere else.
Or a new bomb to drop on the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, yeah, think about it. For what we spent on every single day of the Gulf War, we could fix this problem. Or maybe it was 2 days of the Gulf War. Every 2 days they spent enough money to fix this problem. But, it's like making sure that our oil was still flowing and that Halliburton made lots of money and a bunch of contractors made a lot of money and getting Saddam Hussein, who'd been our point boy for the CIA until he decided to go rogue on us. He's a pretty nasty character, but so long as he was doing what we wanted him to do oil-wise and monetary-wise, we still let him do all of his terrible things and torture his people and all that. But when he started threatening, or started actually going off the dollar standard for selling oil and started selling oil to other people in the world and not us and not using U.S. dollars anymore, and that was too much. That stepped over the line. Torturing, genocide, those things are okay as long as he was doing what we wanted. But he stepped over that line when he went off the U.S. dollar and started, ignoring what we wanted, then we had to take him out. And so we can spend the money there. We can spend the money on Wall Street, but just can't manage to cough up that money to prevent the end of the world as we know it, because it would, oh well. I sure am glad they're looking out for our best interests, aren't you?
Well, yeah, and a lot of the elite, I'll call them, a lot of them, they have these underground bunkers everywhere.
That's what they say.
That is what they say. Now, I've not been in any of them, so I don't know. But,
well, I know somebody who's, kind of designed and helped put together a couple of them. And, yeah, they have the bunkers. But let's face it, if the world has 400 Chernobyls really happens, then a bunker to what? What you going to come out to? It's like, let's face it, the elites would really like to have a world to continue going on. I don't really think they want the end of the world. They're thinking kind of short, blinders. Like, I got my bunker, I'm going to be okay. But let's face it, if the spent fuel ponds go up, it's actually worse than 4,000 Chernobyls, because there's 442 reactors in the world. Say 400 of them went up. That's 400 Chernobyls. But we got 90 spent fuel ponds in the United States alone, with an average of 15 Chernobyls in every spent fuel pond. So what is that? So that's 15 times. That's 1,350 Chernobyls in the United States alone in spent fuel ponds. So worldwide, we're looking at like 4,000 Chernobyls, worst case. So that's a definite game over kind of thing. So hopefully,
yeah, that's like a holiday for the Grim Reaper. Is what it is.
yeah, or roach motels. You know, it's like they say the cockroaches will inherit the earth. So.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
anyway, I like to at least hope that it won't come down to that one. That's for sure.
Well, you know, many people not only think that this will not and could not happen to them, but they actually believe that the government would be prepared to handle it if it should happen. And I get the same reaction when somebody tells me this. It's like, I mean, do you really think they're prepared? I mean, did you forget New Orleans?
Right,
They're
right.
not prepared.
I mean, you're talking without the nuclear issue, just with the grid collapse, you're talking like, 60 New Orleans is happening at the same time around the country. I mean, they didn't do a very good job with one. How will they do with 60 happening at once? I don't have much faith in that.
Exactly.
So, what do? Well, you do your best for yourself and family by, becoming educated and starting to do what you can within your financial and physical means to be prepared in terms of emergency preparedness and long-term sustainability. Maybe develop some plans, have partnership with somebody out. If you live in a metro area, maybe you've got a cousin out in the country. Maybe you make more money in the metro and they, out in the country don't. You can help them out a little bit. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. I've got someplace to go. You work on the community level. There's a transition town movement, which is helping communities to prepare with networking and local energy co-ops and bartering and growing food locally, buying local to deal with the coming peak in world oil production. Well, it turns out, whether you believe it or not, about the peak in world oil production, and insiders in the industry do, the same tools that the transition town movement, uses to build local resilience so that they can handle these kind of future shocks also happen to be the same tools that could build local resilience to cope with long-term grid collapse. So that's a community level thing. And then on the national level, you start yelling bloody murder and saying, read my 400 Chernobyls article. Go to whentechfails.com and check it out. Or just Google it. It's been posted like in Huffington Post in sort of an earlier shortened version, though the Post kind of hid it in a place you couldn't find it unless you're looking directly for it. It it was weird. I've done a bunch of articles in HuffPost, and I've been too busy writing a book and stuff recently, so I haven't done many. But like 3 hours after it posted, it got shut down for comments. Normally it's like a month later it gets shut down for comments. And then I called up and, I emailed and complained, you don't get to talk to a real person. And they said, I'm sorry, we got it back up and going. 3 hours later, it's shut down for comments again. So it was opened for comments for probably a total of 5 or 6 hours instead of the usual month. And it was shut down within that 5 or 6 hours 3 different times. So it only had 5 or 6 hours for comments over a period of a day or two, and it was never open for comments again. So I don't know if there was some government guy said shut this thing down or not, but it can be found by Googling it, but it couldn't have been found if you weren't looking for it. You couldn't find it, and they shut it down right away.
Yeah,
but it got posted on Truth Out, Alternet, Huffington, and on my website, When Tech Fails. And the thing is, if you question where my sources were, at least in the full version on When Tech Fails, there's a full bibliography at the end with hot links to all of the government documents I took this from. So, if you're saying, Matt Stein is some, tree-hugging environmentalist and he's totally out there, just go to those hot links. There's things like the bipartisan congressional EMP Commission report, and that was the EMP commissioner was Dr. William Graham. I keep wanting to call him Billy Graham, but that's a different guy. And Dr. William Graham worked for like 30 years in the DOD and the nuclear industry and the nuclear defense work. And he was Ronald Reagan's chief science advisor for 3 years. And he was chairman of the bipartisan EMP Commission. And he wrote a letter to the Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner last August. and he copied Obama and a bunch of senators, both Republican and Democrats, and several committee, chairmen in the Senate and in Congress. And he said, he warned about long-term grid collapse from EMP or solar storm, and the probability, he said almost certainly there will be multiple Fukushima-like events within the United States in either of these scenarios. And this is the guy who was Ronald Reagan's chief science advisor, so he's no left-wing hippie radical by any means.
Well, I wish they'd bring out the free energy and do away with all this harmful, dangerous, self-destructive technology that we've been using, because it's really scary. If something happens, I've had guests that have come on and talked about Planet X, and now I don't so much worry about Planet X. I worry more about what would happen if something knocked out our grid on a wide scale like that.
And the solar storm is guaranteed, on that scale, is guaranteed to hit. It's just nobody knows when. I mean, the sun, every 11 years, the sun goes through a solar cycle where its poles flip every 11 years like clockwork. And so we're coming up on the next solar maximum, end of 2012, beginning of 2013. And it turns out that, like the Carrington event and the 1921 events, they didn't happen at the solar maximum. There's just a tendency for more extreme solar events to happen at the maximum, but not guaranteed. I think one of those two events is like 3 years off a maximum, and one was like 5 years, meaning it would be right in the middle of the minimum cycle. So there's nothing to freak out because there's a maximum. It happens to coincide with the Mayan calendar, and I'm not telling you to be worried about it. I'm just saying it's just a coincidence. And but maybe they tuned into something, maybe not. I don't know. But it's a guaranteed event. It's just nobody knows when. And since it's been statistically averages every 75 to 100 years, there could be two years apart. There could be 200 years between two of these giant events. The last one was 90 years ago. The one before that was 60 years earlier than that. So do the math. Basically, if I was a betting man, I'd say we're either due or overdue. And I'm hoping we'll get our act together before it happens, but there's no guarantees on that.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath on that, although it would be great. Matthew, let's take a call. We've got Rascola in Florida. He's been waiting for a while. Rascola, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Rascola.
Amazing information. You kind of answered the question I was going to ask, but I'm going to, if you don't mind, kind of revisit it a little bit because I don't think I'm real clear about it. My question was going to be regarding like our vehicles that use these electronic computers. From my understanding is that they also would be under some degree of scrutiny from this thing. Am I right or wrong?
Well, EMPs and solar storms, I didn't really go into the difference. In the solar storm, it's not very likely to have serious effects on your digital electronics. EMPs are the opposite. It turns out that an EMP, which is an electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear device that's been detonated miles above the planet, like between 10 miles and 100 miles, typically above the surface of the Earth, you have three effects from an EMP. You have an E1 effect, which is like a speed of light, nanosecond kind of effect, happens like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a blink of an eye. And that's kind of like an electrostatic effect that's widespread, and it tends to fry a lot of chips in digital stuff. But some will be more protected and better protected than others. It turns out in actual EMP tests that cars are fairly robust EMP-wise. Not totally, but in actual simulated EMP tests, about 1 in 7 cars driving down the road will stop and not be functional. And most of the cars that are parked and turned off at the time will be okay, because a car is like an isolated device. It's got rubber tires, it's got a metal box, it's got sparky things going off all the time inside the car, and so they're fairly robust from an electrostatic point of view. Now, it turns out, though, the really scary stuff is that pretty much 100% failure of complex digital control systems. So anything with digital electronics that is connected with a lot of wires, like think factories, think nuclear power plants, think oil refineries, anything where there's a bunch of like digital stuff that's got wires connecting, say sensors and actuators and control systems, basically all of the digital brains and guts and ears, nose, and eyes that run all of our systems that control the infrastructure. There's pretty much 100% failure in those digital systems. Can you hear me okay, or is this phone signal frying now?
I hear you, but I hear some scratches. Sounds like
it's probably from the storm that's going on outside here is affecting the phone line a little bit. We got major wind and snow happening.
Oh.
Yeah, if it gets really bad, we'll cut off and you'll have to call me. I'll email you the other number to call in on, and we'll try another line. But hopefully this is as bad as it gets. So that's the E2 effect, and then the E3 effect is, oh gosh, that's pretty bad now.
I'll tell you what, Riscola, hold on with us for a moment, and Matthew, you hang on too. We'll take a break. Matthew Stein, we're back, and Riscola, you're back with us as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. I'd like to ask you something before you continue because I'm not real clear about what you were saying. Sure. I understand that I can't think of the word I want to use. As far as electronics goes, they're pretty much out of the picture on this go-around. But the wires themselves, I think, is what you're referring to. The wires themselves are in danger of what? Melting?
No. The wires act like antennas that pick up the electromagnetic energy and bring them into electronic devices. So small, discrete devices like an iPod or an iPhone stand a pretty good chance, especially if they're turned off at the time and not functioning, pretty good chance of surviving the EMP, contrary to popular opinion. Most cars, even modern digital cars, they'll have anomalies if they're running at the time of the EMP, but 7 out of 10 cars will, or 1 out of 7 cars will fail, and 6 out of 7 cars will still, or 7 out of 8, somewhere like that. Roughly between 15%, 20% of small trucks, 10 to 15% of cars will be rendered inoperable immediately. So it's not like nuclear saying where instantly every electronic device in the country fails. The problem is that the critical stuff, where you have, digital electronics is very susceptible to damage from EMP. And especially the more wires you have hooked to that digital stuff to act like antennas to bring in the energy of the EMP, the more prone to damage it is. So in EMP testing, they found that digital control systems and SCADAs, which are sensing, control, and data acquisition systems that are like connect all of the sensors and actuators in our factories, to like remotely sense processes and then run solenoid valves and actuators to make things work. And similarly, they make things work like nuclear power plants, oil refineries, factory processing equipment, pollution control equipment, sewage treatment plants, and water treatment plants, gas treatment. Basically all of the critical infrastructure. That stuff pretty much fails 100%. Enough digital components are fried within the system that the systems collapse and fall apart. So, who cares if your little radio works if the radio station doesn't work, and if the grid doesn't work, and if, the nuclear local power plant is down and the sewage pumps aren't pumping sewage, and you can't pump gas because the grid is down, and you can't buy anything with a money machine card, and the internet is down, so the digital remote diagnostic equipment that figures out where all the problems are and sends workers out to fix the stuff, that's blinded and not working. So, the guys that still know how to, go through painstakingly, like piece by piece and troubleshoot and fix stuff, most of them aren't around anymore or don't remember how to do it. And, so you're talking like the infrastructure collapsing outward and multiple Fukushima-like events probably happening within the affected zone. So, for instance, in 1962, I think it was either 61 or 2, when the Soviets did their EMP testing over Kazakhstan, they put a bunch of military generators, diesel generators, in place, assuming that the grid was going to collapse. And, the grid did collapse. In fact, the EMP pulse induced so much power, they had a power station 600 miles away, 1,000 kilometers away, and from the area centered under the EMP test. And there was a power line that was buried 2 meters at 6 feet underground. That's a 600-mile long line that carried power from this power plant into the area where the EMP test was. And it induced so much current in it that it burned the power plant down at the other end. But not only that, it also fried the backup generators that were pre-microelectronics, that were supposedly, hundreds of times more robust and EMP resistant than modern electronics because of all the digital chips that are easily fried by EMP. So those failed. So it's, you're looking at a situation where, you can protect your personal electronics and put things inside of Faraday cages. And if you have extra parts and you want to store them, I think it's a great idea. But it doesn't save the grid, and it doesn't save all of that infrastructure that makes our world go around, that's totally cooked because the digital control systems the complex systems that make our modern world run have enough digital components that fail, but the systems just fall apart and totally fail. 100% failure in the systems. So, you don't have 100% failure in the small parts, but the stuff you really care about, pretty much 100% down within the zone. So to give you an idea how big a zone you're talking about, say they bought like a small, or bought or built a small nuclear weapon, like, 10 kiloton tactical nuke, Nagasaki, Hiroshima size bomb, and they bought a Scud missile on the black market for like $30 million, and they loaded on a junk freighter off the United States and blew it off, and sunk the freighter after they launched it, so nobody even knew what country they were, where they came from, because whoever launched it killed themselves, which in the days of suicide attacks is pretty reasonable assumption, so that they couldn't retaliate on a particular country, destroy the evidence, who are you going to hit? And so it blows off of the United States and it affects a zone like, say, 500 miles. So that's enough to wipe out, Boston, New York City, Washington, D.C., all of that stuff. Pretty much totally cook the infrastructure and probably cause a number of nuclear power plants to go Fukushima style right away. Not for sure, but chances are pretty damn good if that Kazakhstan blast knocked out the old-fashioned, quote, robust diesel generators. Chances are that at least some of those nuclear power plants, that the backup generators will fail and the control systems that keep the plant going will fail. And so without either of them there, they're going to melt down. So if you have a big weapon, then you're talking launching the big weapon off, you're talking a 1,500-mile circle. So that would be pick out a big map of North America, draw a big circle, and intersect Dallas, Texas, Miami, Florida, and Quebec City in Canada. So that intersection includes about 2/3, 3/4 of the population of the United States, includes Chicago, most of the central Midwestern states, and the entire eastern seaboard except for the very tip of Florida and the very southern Texas. And that's from a single large nuclear device. Now, say, according to Reza Khalili, who is a pseudonym for a guy who was trained and educated in the United States, Iranian-born. When the Shah of Iran was overthrown, he went back to Iran and joined the Revolutionary Guard. And after a couple years, he got disillusioned there and became a CIA spy and eventually moved to the U.S. and undercover now, reports on the situation. Now, whether he's real or whether he's a fake guy that they just, publish articles in his name, I don't know. I don't know the guy myself, so I can't speak for him. But according to him and according to others, Iran already has at least 2 and maybe as many as 10 nuclear devices they assembled from, purchased from Pakistan or bought from stuff from other countries, Kazakhstan, who knows. And so say we went in and bombed, or Israel went in and bombed nuclear facility there. They used it as an excuse, and they actually had these devices, and they threw a couple of them at us, one on the West Coast, one in the central Midwest, and effectively knocked out 95% of all industry and 90% of the infrastructure, servicing 90% of the population of the United States. That could be done in a half hour's time. I hope it never happens. It's.
I hope not either. And a lot of the cars, especially in the last decade, have computers in them, don't they?
Right. They do have computers in them, and because a car is an isolated box, metal box, kind of like a Faraday cage with rubber tires, and it has sparky, staticky things happening all the time from spark plugs, they're relatively robust. But the car doesn't do very much good when none of the gas pumps are working. When, if you can't get gas to put in that car, and even if, 6 out of 7 or 7 out of 8 cars is still operating after the EMP, they're going to run out of gas pretty damn soon unless somebody has a big stock of fuel in their back pocket, like a farm-type tank with a hand-crank pump, so you don't need power to run it, and you can fill your own gas tank. Then you can go for a while. And there's people like Gary Knoll out of New York City who says that his whole game plan is to make sure that you have a network of people, and somebody in your group has a little trailer, and you put like 50-gallon drums of fuel on the trailer, and you have enough stuff set up, and you have a rendezvous, and you have a game plan, so that when you realize, far before the average person realizes how screwed we are, because the infrastructure is going to collapse, it's going to get worse day by day by day for months and maybe even years, then you get out of Dodge quick before everybody else, and you've got your own self-contained fuel supply and all of that. So, provided some posse doesn't show up with a bunch of AK-47s and take all your cool stuff from you. So
that's what I was just going to say. I wouldn't doubt if the government wouldn't say, hey, this is a matter of national security, any substantial amounts of fuel that they would probably confiscate in the name of national security. So,
anything could happen. I mean, there's no way one person can plan for every potential possibility. So you do your best within your means, and if you've got money and maybe you're older and you're not physically very robust, then you stock up on all cool stuff and things to barter, and then you team up with people who don't have all the stuff, but they're younger and have the physical skills. So you provide the things they couldn't afford, and they provide the protection and the physical wherewithal to help you do what you got to do, and it's your partner. You're much stronger as a community or as a network than you are as an individual, because the lone wolf survivalist with all the cool stuff may well be a target for someone who's meaner, tougher, better organized, has a bunch of bad friends, and they're going to come when you're sleeping or come at you from multiple directions and take all your cool stuff away. So it's, like I said, you do your best within your ability, and certainly in a collapse-type scenario, skills and talents and knowledge will be worth at least as much or more than cool stuff. And so, I mean, it'd be great if you can have everything, but,
well, the cool
most
stuff
of us
won't
don't
work no more. So it'd be back to the little house on the prairie days, and as long as we don't get fried by radiation, I think I can handle it. Yeah, I like the computers and all that stuff, but I can handle it.
Right,
the kids
right.
would have problems.
Yeah. Well, maybe it'll be a kinder, gentler, more sane, more sustainable planet when it's all said and done and everything shakes down. But it might be some real hell to go through between here and there.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. And Ruscala, you're still here, my friend. I'm sorry. We didn't mean to keep going on. But,
no, I don't mind. I have a question regarding temperature.
Sure.
Okay.
When all this is going on, what happens to the temperature on the planet?
Nothing.
It doesn't really affect. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's electromagnetic. It's not like you're being fried by the sun stuff. It just gets the upper atmosphere electromagnetically charged, and so it doesn't, like when northern lights happen and you see them, it's not any hotter outside. It's just the sky's all lit up really cool at night. And I didn't finish there's the E1, E2, and E3 effects. So the E1 is like, nanoseconds, speed of light, sparky type thing. E2 is like in the next half second to second or two, it's like 50,000 lightning bolts happening in the affected zone all at the same instant. And many of the spark arresters and things like that will have been disabled by the E1 effect. So a lot of your electronic stuff will get cooked. It's it's plugged into a wall outlet because a lot of those plug strips and things you rely on for protecting things have been disabled by the E1. And then the E3 effect happens from about a second or two until 15 or 20 minutes later. And that's like a long, slow burn, and that's essentially the same electromagnetic field inducing strength as the extreme solar storm, only over a much smaller area. So it's essentially it cooks the big transformers, and you have grid collapse only within the affected zone. 500 miles for the smaller one, 1,500 miles for a really big nuclear device. And I've been told by some military guys who worked in the nuclear stuff and had top secret clearances that if it's an EMP optimized device, like a super EMP weapon that the Soviets and Chinese have, and maybe some other countries have, but we know Soviets and Chinese do, that the effect will be closer to the Newt Gingrich, like electronic devices, just all electronic devices just cook and fry within the affected zone and don't work. And that's with like a super EMP weapon, not just your standard run-of-the-mill 15 kiloton or 1 megaton device that you can pick up at the local drugstore, right? Anyway, I attempted a little humor on a tough subject.
Anything else for Scala?
No, I got it. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's a tremendous amount of information.
You're
All
welcome.
right, well, thank you.
And I will say that the EMP stuff and nuclear survival stuff is all in the new book, When Disaster Strikes, the last couple of chapters before the final closing summary chapter. And they're not in When Technology Fails. And, When Tech Fails is kind of a huge encyclopedic book that covers, the subtitle describes it well, a manual for self-reliance, sustainability, and surviving the long emergency. So it covers a huge number of topics under those three headings, whereas When Disaster Strikes is really an emergency prepping and survival handbook. People said, hey, When Tech Fails is way too big for my grab-and-go kit. I want something smaller that I can throw in my car or my backpack and go. And so it's a narrower focus, but about a third of the material is borrowed from When Tech Fails. About 2/3 is all new in When Disaster Strikes. So some of it's shared. The built-in first aid manual is essentially the same with minor updates. The survival manuals is essentially the same with some updates. The prepping guide is essentially the same with different and simpler to follow organization. But then there's all kinds of new stuff in there too, like EMP and solar storms, and surviving and prepping for particular catastrophes like hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, surviving extreme cold without heat and power, those kinds of things, all new in When Disaster Strikes. So that's my sales pitch. But people always ask me the question, like, what's the difference and which one should I have? And, well, if the world melted down tomorrow, I'd really want a copy of When Technology Fails in my back pocket. That would be, like, top of my list. But, if I want something for my go bag, I'll put the lighter book in there. And if I just want to learn prepping, I'd just start with When Disaster Strikes. And if I really want to learn about solar storms and EMP and really strategize for that, that's in When Disaster Strikes, not in When Tech Fails.
Right. Now, because that's a question I was going to ask is what people could do to better prepare themselves. They should probably, we've talked about this before, maybe going to garage sales and getting, stuff that they might have used before all the power equipment came along, like maybe hand hand-cranked can openers and maybe
Right.
some oil lamps and things like that, candles.
Yeah, those things are all quite helpful. And if you want to protect some things, like you want a shortwave radio, because I mean, in the event of a solar storm or an EMP, the communications, all electrical communications, will be totally gone for a while, period of time, hours. But when things start coming back together, typically the ham radio guys will be talking to each other and trying to figure out what's going on. And so, if you have, if you want to store at least a hand crank Bay-Gen free play hand radio, it'll pick up AM, FM, and shortwave, and stuff it inside of a galvanized garbage can, or if you want to, that does what's called a Faraday cage. It's basically just a metal box. Will protect stuff fairly well inside. And if you want to be really careful, you do what's called a double Faraday cage. So you take some things you would like to see surviving an EMP, and maybe you wrap them in aluminum foil or aluminum screen, then you put a garbage bag around them as an insulator, and then you throw all these different gadgets into a second metal box called like a galvanized garbage can, or say a refrigerator with the cord cut off, or a small a Faraday cage would be like an old microwave oven with the cord cut off. You don't want a cord sticking out. And so that'll protect certain things. But really, it's more like having your strategies for, do you live near a nuclear power plant? Do you need to exit? Are you in a major metro area where you couldn't possibly feed and supply all those people with what they need? Or are you in, say, a small metro area surrounded by a large urban, farming area where far more food is grown than is consumed locally? In those cases, there's maybe not a need to leave the area, but in the case of the major metro area where there's no way you could feed and take care of all those people in the event of a grid down for a long term, then you got to think about, having the ability to leave the area in that event if you wanted to, stand a chance of surviving it. So, and think about what's valuable. Some people say, well, storing gold and silver because you can barter is great. And I'll admit, it's a really good idea. But let me just share this story with you. When my wife is a Dutch-Indonesian immigrant. Well, she was born in Holland, but her mom was Dutch-Indonesian. And so she grew up in the Bay Area after they immigrated, and hung out with a lot of Dutch-Indo immigrants. And there was this beautiful, joyful, wonderful woman that she called her Aunt Dee, and they were poor farmers in Indonesia. And they came to America with this little bag of jewels and gold. And it's like, well, how do poor farmers, get a bag of jewels and gold? Well, during the Indonesian Revolution, there were poor farmers, but they had food. So every stack of grain, of rice or, vegetables, was some rich person pried a little jewel out of their necklace or their ring and traded that jewel for that sack of rice. So if you don't have a lot of money, no sense in storing silver and gold. Store the stuff that will be worth a lot more silver and gold when things fall apart. So, you can buy a lot more of that stuff that will keep you alive and is very tradable for pretty low dollars today while the world's still working well, rather than storing a lot of dollars in gold and silver and trading really expensive gold and silver for, a sack of grain or a sack of beans when things fall apart. So just remember that story. It's like, sure. I mean, if you got plenty, then store a little bit of everything and cover your bases. But, if you're like most people in this day and age and, you're not exactly rolling in the dough, then use it wisely, what you do have.
Right, and I hear a lot of people talk about, you got to get your gold and silver now, and I'm thinking, well, you can't eat that stuff, I think you should get the essentials first, and then if you got some left over after that, sure, get yourself some gold and silver, but you better have a way to protect all this stuff, too. Right.
That's my idea, too. And, certainly guns and ammo are great for trading and bartering, but, the basics. Start with the basics, and then as you have extra money, then start doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And You know, on the guns and ammo thing, it's like some people say, well, you're a target and someone will just want to take that from you. But on the other hand, you know, if you show up if you're on your front porch and you clearly know what you're doing and you're not someone to mess with, they'll go to someone else's front porch instead of yours. So it's a mixed bag, and I can't tell you what's right for you, but I consider that we live in a heavily armed country, and it's a kind of necessary evil if you're going to face off with somebody armed, and I hope I never have to do that. And I'm certainly not the kind of guy who would, if some father or mother was, you know, out there begging for some food for his kid, that I'd send them on with a shotgun. I mean, you know, I hope it doesn't come to like that, you know.
I hope not either, but you know, when you think about a scenario like what we've been talking about tonight, and the seriousness of it, I mean, it could get that way. I mean, you look at how people are now. You've got people who are crazy enough to go in stores and shoot somebody to get the money out of the register. Imagine how many more of those people would be on the street if all the power went out. So,
right,
you
or
know,
road rage. You know?
Yeah.
Somebody cut me off on the freeway, so I blew them away, right? You know, had a bad day at the office. I thought I'd just take it out by blowing off the guy on the freeway, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, because the police aren't going to be matching fingerprints on computers, that's for sure. So, you know, people are just going to do what they want. And hopefully the majority of the people use sense and, you know, care about others. So, you know, I'm the same way. Even if I didn't have much food at all, there's no way I could send off some mother and father and their child. I mean, I couldn't do it. So, you know, hopefully there's more people who think that way. But, you know, people do desperate things in desperate times. So
that's right. That's right.
Now, what about climate change? How could this affect, I mean, obviously it can affect the grid. It can affect nuclear power plants, you know, and not to mention that we have been experiencing what seems to be climate change, flooding in some areas and earthquakes like never before. And, you know, some of it's blamed on weather modification, but nevertheless, it's happening. Yeah.
I mean, I think most people who are, you know, over 30 know that the climate's different and much less stable now than it was when they were kids. And
absolutely.
Certainly, I have friends from who lived in Kansas this summer and said, you know, I asked him how it was going. He said, 90 days, no rain. The weeds are dead. The ponds are dry. The creek is dry. And the trees have lost all of their leaves. And it was 10 degrees hotter last week. This is like in July, he was telling me this, or August, early August. So it was 10 degrees hotter yesterday in Kansas than it was in Death Valley. And it said absolutely miserable. And my friend on the Vince Spinelli, USA Prepares, on this ranch or farm in the middle of Missouri, outside of Springfield. And he said, yeah, basically the same thing. He said that they got one haying this year instead of the normal 3, and they had to break in all their haying. And the farmers who weren't smart and sold their stock off early were getting, you know, terrible dollars for their livestock, and they had no choice but to sell it because they didn't have the money to keep feeding them, and because they had to buy hay from out of state to keep feeding them because they'd already used up the hay they were supposed to have for winter. They'd already used up by mid-August just trying to keep the livestock alive. And it was pretty sad. And it wasn't until that hurricane blew through that they finally got some decent rain. So it was pretty rough. And same thing there, all the trees. He said it was fall. The beginning of August, it was already fall. And the trees had no water, so they lost all their leaves. Looked like November, only it was beginning of August. And just never seen it like that.
Yeah, you know, I remember a couple of years ago here in South Carolina, we had all the trees started just blooming early because the weather was so warm. Then we got a freeze, and it just confuses the hell out of these trees and different plants. So now that brings me to something else that you had wrote about, and that's deforestation. Now, I don't really like the sound of that, but explain how this would happen. Are we talking about diseases or in the plant life, or are we talking about climate change destroying?
Well, we're talking about climate change tied to deforestation, and deforestation is just basically people cutting down the world's forests. You know, all that cool, cheap furniture at Costco comes from, you know, Indonesia and China and other places. Actually, China had such severe floods from deforestation that they've outlawed it, and they're pretty severe in China when you break the law. You know, it's not like a slap on the wrist. It's like, oh, okay, off
right.
with your hip. And so they started just buying their wood from other places. Let's deforest other lands like Papua New Guinea and Indonesia and all that. So, you know, in the Brazilian rainforest, all those kinds of places of the world. And so that comes at a price. I mean, the population of the planet and the industrialization combined have just skyrocketed. I mean, and so the impact on our world is huge. So basically about 50% of the world's forests are gone now. And over half of that change has happened in the last 30 or 40 years. So, you know, it's accelerating the decline in the world's forests and the oceans. And when you cut down the forests, you start affecting the climate for two reasons. One is that deforestation contributes more to greenhouse gases in the world than all of the factories and industrial plants in the world and all of the transportation, planes, trains, and automobiles. Deforestation contributes more to greenhouse gases than those other two put together, which is pretty radical. And so you're affecting the climate in two ways. One is each giant tree acts as a huge water pump to recycle water back into the atmosphere. So when you have like a big, giant, old growth tree with pine needles or leaves, doesn't matter which, it has the evaporative surface area equal to a 40-acre lake. Now, I have never done the calculation, but it came from a reliable source. And so when you cut down these trees, see, each tree, it's like the tree acts as a water pump. It sucks water up through its roots, and it goes up through the trunk and out its leaves and needles, and the sun beats on it, and it evaporates out of the leaves and needles, and it goes up into the clouds and makes more clouds and comes down as rain down wind. So when you cut down the trees and deforest the trees, you have something called desertification happening downwind. So, for instance, the cradle of modern civilization was between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Like 7,000 years ago, it was like the Garden of Eden, and it was such a lush, tropical, wonderful climate that human beings flourished. So what did they do when they flourished? Well, they made cities, they made lots of babies, they cut the trees down, they irrigated the land. Well, over time, they cut the trees down, and you start getting desertification, and you irrigate the land, and you start getting salt when the irrigation evaporates out. So that area that was the Fertile Crescent, was the Garden of Eden, is now Iraq and Iran. I mean, look at Desert Storm. Doesn't look much like Garden of Eden to me. So
not at all.
Things, so I wrote an article called "The Perfect Storm." Went quite viral on the internet, and it's on Huffington Post. The Perfect Storm: 6 Trends Converging on Collapse, and it's basically, in a nutshell, says that if we can continue all of these 6 major trends, they're all, like if you draw the graphs, they're all headed steeply downward towards the bottom. So, you all draw graphs in high school, and, if a graph is drawn, a trend is headed towards the bottom. You don't do something different, it's going to hit bottom. And each of these 6 trends are each individually potentially civilization busters, and combined, they're like, Collapseville. And so far, we haven't really done much to stop or slow any of these 6 trends. And so we're headed, in my opinion, regardless of solar storms, regardless of EMPs, not counting Nibiru, not counting any outside influence, just simply continuing business as usual. The same trends that got us here, where we're collapsing the oceans, we're changing the atmosphere, we're changing the weather, our population is continuing to grow, and skyrocket, and all of these trends together guarantee business as usual will collapse the world as we know it, and things will all fall apart. And from the population point of view, people say, oh, Matt's a globalist because he thinks we should control our population. But put this picture in your head. In the last 10 years, more people, more babies have been added to our population in our world in the last 10 years than from the time that Jesus walked the earth till Abraham Lincoln.
1,800 years from Jesus to Abraham Lincoln, more babies added to the world in the last 10 years. And since the year 2000, from the year 2000 till October of 2011, that's just under 12 years, we added 1 billion people to the planet. That's more people than lived in our entire world 200 years ago. So that's like taking all the people in the world in the year 200 and adding an entire planet's worth of people every 12 years. I mean, no wonder the oceans are collapsing. No wonder the fisheries, 11 out of 15 of the world's major ocean fisheries are either dead or in danger of short-term collapse. No wonder 25% of the world's coral reefs are in danger of short-term collapse or already dead. No wonder over half of the world's most prolific, most incredible reef, the Great Barrier Reef, they just found out now since 1960s, half of the Great Barrier Reef has died. Half of it. The richest, most incredible reef in the world, half gone, half dead now, just since the 1960s. And so we are stressing our planet and just business as usual. And we're either going to wake up and get, I'm in the group of optimistic doomers that actually thinks if we get shaken up badly enough and really, really something really huge happens, that maybe we stand a chance of waking up to the point where we actually change the way we do things in the world. The problem is that the 1% got on the top by the old way of doing things. But the old way of doing things is killing the planet. So they have a huge stake at keeping the old way going. But if they keep the old way going, it's game over. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of how long we got before, it all catches up to us and between the climate change and the oceans and the weather and the population and the trees and the peak in world oil, just everything together just becomes too much for governments to handle, and things just fall apart and collapse. And the collapsing ecosystems, we're now having more and more troubles every year feeding the world's population, because combination of overuse of groundwaters, irrigation, and climate change, and decrease and factory farming methods where we're flushing the topsoil. It took millions of years to generate. We're just flushing it down. In 200 years, we flushed down what the last 10,000 years took to build in topsoil, from modern farming methods. So all of these unsustainable things are catching up to us, and either we wake up or we end up like the dinosaurs. It's like Mother Nature doesn't care. It's like species come and go, and overshoot and collapse happens in Mother Nature all the time. It's just when it happens to people, it's a tragedy. When it happens to a fox or some herd of deer on some remote island, nobody cares much. But it happens to the whole world and takes down most of the human population. There's going to be a lot of people pretty upset by that one.
Well, yeah, and when technology fails, I think that will definitely simmer down the population rather quickly, because you're going to have a lot of people with no heat, a lot of people totally unprepared, governments unprepared. It'll be chaos, and that's why we should be putting our money into better technologies, maybe finding another Earth-like planet, and I'm one who believes that there could be a possibility of maybe inhabiting Mars at some point, and maybe, spreading us out a little bit. I don't know what the answer would be to the population. I mean, we don't want to put laws on people like in China. Yeah. We have a good planet here, but we have to manage ourselves, or we'll spoil the nest. I mean, the classic example of overshooting nature is St. Matthew's Island in the Bering Sea. Is this island between Alaska and Russia. And back in, let me see if I open up the page and I can't find it, but it's, okay, here it is. 1944. They put a small herd of reindeer on this island, St. Matthew Island, 128 square mile spot of land in the Bering Sea. Abundant food, no predators. So 1957, the initial herd of 29 animals had grown to exceed 1,350 deer. So 29 deer multiplied to 1,350 in, 13 years. Okay.
1963, that's another 6 years later, the deer herd quadruples again, reaches 6,000. Now, that size of an island can handle about 1,500 deer based on, looking at similar islands. And normally there's predators in islands to keep the deer herd in check, but no predators, St. Matthew's Island. So what happens when you get 6,000 deer on an island that can only handle about 1,500? Well, they ate everything in sight. The topsoil washed away in the winter rains. The population starves. So in 3 years, it crashes down to 42. 42 deer left, 1966. Mid-1970s, the last starving, sickly deer on St. Matthew's Island, the last sickly reindeer, all alone, dies a lonely death. So that's what happens when a population exceeds the carrying capacity of the land and soils the nest totally, irreparably. That soil washed away, so it'll be hundreds of years before St. Matthew's Island can once again support anywhere near the numbers of deer it could have supported before they ruined the space by overeating and everything washing away. And so that's basically either we control ourselves like proactive, smart human beings should be able to do, or we pretend that God is on our side and God's going to fix it for us and we don't have to worry about such things ourselves because we have an infinite world and we can do with it as we please, which is the pioneering attitude. Then we'll end up like the reindeer. It's like Mother Nature doesn't care. There's just natural consequences to natural actions.
Yeah, I always say the Earth is pretty much alive and has its own immune system. The Earth will be here for a long time. It's us who will not be here if we continue to abuse her, and that's what we're doing.
Well, I'm getting it's been a long
collapse
evening.
of the world. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's been a long evening, and I've been enjoying it, but I think it's getting close to time to wrap this up.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I was just going to say, collapse of the world's oceans, very scary scenario, but then all of it is. And I do want to thank you for being a guest here on Late Night in the Midlands. I definitely appreciated our talk tonight. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I like to leave people with my motto, and that is I urge everyone to do your best to change the world, and at the same time, do your best to be ready for those changes in the world. And, thank you so much for having me on tonight. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you too, Matthew. And if you would, please give out the website and maybe where the people can get their hands on the book as well. We do have you linked up over on latenightinthemidlands.com, by the way.
Oh, terrific, terrific. Yeah, and you can buy the book at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of those places and support your local bookstores, or if you go to my website, whentechfails.com, great free articles. Really, if you look under articles, all kinds of free information, grab-and-go kits, purifying water, protecting yourself and family from the next superbugs. That 400 Chernobyls articles posted at When Tech Fails with all of the hot links for the references. So if you're kind of thinking maybe I'm full of it, then or you want to learn more, then by all means click on those hot links and check out those references. And it's all really good information. And if you buy any of and there's a bunch of recommended books there, and if you happen to click on the links to Amazon, then I get a small percentage off of that. It doesn't cost you anymore, and it helps support the website and keep things rolling. So it's always appreciated. Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking time out with us tonight, and please keep up the great work. You're welcome, Michael, and good evening, everybody. I hope I didn't bum you out too much and inspired you to go out and start getting ready to deal with some things coming around the corner. I don't know exactly what, but you got to be ready for rocking and rolling in this society and in this world. Good night. Absolutely. All right, good night. All right, everybody, that's Matthew Stein, and we Matthew Stein, are you with us?
I am with you.
All right, great. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Oh, well, technology
Yeah.
never fails, remember?
That's right. That's right. So, hey, welcome back to Late Night in the Midlands. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I was just reading off to people about the 450 nuclear reactors in the world and 104 of them in the United States, and the question on whether all these could fail at one time, and even if they failed at different times, would it really matter? We'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't we?
Oh, yeah, we'd be in a deep pile of it'd be very serious trouble if even a significant percentage of them failed at all, at roughly the same time. We'd be in big trouble. I mean, you're talking
Right.
multiple Fukushima-like events happening all over, mostly in the northern hemisphere. There's a few in Argentina, and a few in India, but the vast majority of these are in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, we've got quite a few of them here in South Carolina, from what I understand.
Yeah. When you look at the map of the United States and where the nuclear facilities are, Georgia, South Carolina, pretty dense over there. Don't know why you guys like them so much. Yeah.
I don't know. I moved here from New York, and so I've never been a fan of these things. And when I found out, I don't know, probably a year ago, how many we had here, it was quite a few. I can't think off the top of my head. I think it was something, I don't know if it was somewhere around 30 of them. If there's that many over this way, that is a huge, huge concern. Huge concern. There's a big fault line that comes through Charleston and parts of Columbia, too.
Yeah,
So,
you guys have the New Madrid fault out there, the biggest fault in North America, pretty much. But it doesn't go off that often. But when it does, it has gone off in a big way. And so there'd be probably a dozen, anywhere from a few to a dozen nuclear power plants if the New Madrid went off in a big way.
So what are we talking here? Let's talk about Fukushima first. How serious is this, and is the dangers worldwide, as I believe them to be? But I'm no expert on this stuff.
High-tech equipment and robots that can handle the radiation to really go in and start doing the demolition and dismantling job of taking the debris out and getting all those rods out of the ponds. That's what they're saying, at least. So they're talking like a 5 to 10 year plan to unload the crap out of those ponds. The question is, well, they're probably gone already a year into that plan now. So say it's 4 to 9 years. Will those fuel ponds be still standing in how many years? Will they still be full of water and still standing? And if they lose their water, whether it's from an earthquake or because they burn a hole in the bottom of the pond, or the one you're talking about that's sinking, whatever reason it's sinking, that it sinks in such a way that it spills all the water out of that pond, chances that it'll still be, viable and underwater in 10 years from now. And of course, it's only underwater because they keep filling it with fire hoses. But
Right.
It's not like there's a water supply that automatically fills itself up. It's got to be filled with big pumping trucks and fire hoses right now. So you're talking a serious situation. Now backtracking to Chernobyl. When Chernobyl burned, there was like the Chernobyl 200, where roughly a couple hundred people basically volunteered to get lethal or near lethal doses of radiation in order to save their country. And so those people, some of them survived, most of them died. Some of them died very short-term deaths, like within the following week or two, and some died in the next few months, and others died over the next 10 years, and a few of them are still alive, but like totally disabled and really, really sick. But then they figured officially like 10,000 people died from Chernobyl, but the epistemological study done in the in Russia, Soviet Union's gone, but in Russia they did a recent study released like a year or two ago, and they found that from looking at like deaths and types of deaths, and death rates in the years before Fukushima versus after, they found that since Chernobyl, roughly 1 million people died in early, yucky death from cancer and tumors and various illnesses caused by Chernobyl, and 3 million people have been sickened and led, very sick, unhealthy lives because of Chernobyl. Now, that's just one Chernobyl's worth of radioactivity. And here you're talking between the Tsushima, on top of these blown up buildings, and everyone saw the pictures of the buildings blowing their tops, are these two swimming pools called spent fuel ponds, filled with, each of them have roughly 10 Chernobyls worth of radioactive material in the pond. So you figure there's a Chernobyl worth of radioactive material in each of the reactor cores, and they've blown their tops, and they're still need to be cooled continuously, or they'll still melt down and cause even more damage, China syndrome kind of stuff. But on top of that, you have these buildings that have been kind of blown to pieces like a bomb hit them, and the roofs are sort of blown off. And on top of these buildings, then, there's these pools of water just filled with debris. All of the machinery, that really expensive, cool, high-tech stuff that was designed to unload those fuel rods and load fresh rods in, that's all blown to pieces, and it's lying inside the spent fuel ponds and all around them. So here you've got these 4-story tall buildings that have big holes blown through them all over, that look like they're on their last legs, they're barely standing up. They're in a seismically active zone. And on top of these buildings, they have, the upper story has the roof blown off, and there's this pool full of wreckage and debris, and inside the wreckage and debris is also 10 Chernobyls worth of rods just sitting there. So you say, well, okay, so what? You know, they're like spent fuel rods, right? You know, they're not so bad because they've already been used. Well, no. It turns out that you have to keep these rods cool for 3 to 5 years after you take them out of the reactor. They're still so hot that if you lose cooling, then they can start to melt. They can start to melt down and burn, even if they're not in a reactor core, just sitting out there in the pond. So these ponds, if they're left untended, will boil dry. And one of the reasons you saw in Fukushima, you saw these, like, you may or may not have seen, but they had these big tanker trucks, like with huge fire hoses blowing water up on top of the buildings. Well,
yeah,
they weren't blowing water on top of the buildings to keep the reactor cool because they couldn't get inside the reactor with that water. They were blowing water on top of the buildings to keep the spent fuel ponds cool. Because see, a spent fuel pond will boil itself dry in between 3 days and 22 days, depending on how recently, you know, if they're not replenished with cooling water. They'll boil dry, and then they'll start to burn. See, these things get so hot. Each of these fuel rods is encased in something called zirconium, because regular steel just doesn't cut it in this highly radioactive environment. It would get brittle and fall apart and fall to pieces. So they have them encased in a metal called zirconium, which, you know, I never really heard of before I talked to some nuclear engineers about Fukushima. And it turns out that zirconium is like really, really tough when it comes to radioactivity. It can handle it much better than steel can. But if it gets too hot, it starts burning like a Roman candle. It's just like, you ever burn magnesium foil in a chem lab in high school? You ever see that happen?
Have.
Yeah, it's pretty bright, huh? I mean, pretty amazing that metal burns so bright. I mean, it's like you got to shield your eyes. You burn your eyes. You see spots in front of your eyes if you don't shield them or squint or, you know, turn away or look through really dark glasses. So this zirconium burns just like magnesium when it gets really hot, and it'll keep burning. So if these fuel ponds boil dry, then you've got a situation, or if they run dry, like an earthquake happens and they fall apart, or they sprout leaks and they lose all their water, then shortly after that, you know, within a few hours, these fuel rods will start like overheating and burning off like radioactive Roman candles. And then you have not just one, but like 10 Chernobyls worth of radioactive burning going on in each of the two spent fuel ponds. There's about 60 Chernobyls worth of material in Fukushima. So if the whole site went up, you know, you're talking like 50, 60 Chernobyls worth of radioactive material that could theoretically get out in the environment. But certainly the two big concerns, those fuel ponds. Now, you say, well, how bad is it? Well, if you Google Washington's blog, like George Washington with an S on there, Washington's blog, Spent Fuel Ponds, you'll get a visual tour of the spent fuel ponds in Fukushima, and it's mind-blowing. I mean, it's really, really scary stuff because you see how bad it really is. It's like, whoa, why is not the regular media showing me this? I mean, this is like
I understand one of them
serious.
thinking.
That's what people are saying. That's what people are saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been hearing that, but I haven't spent the time to verify and follow up on it. I know it's a huge problem, thinking or not. It's like a 3 to 5 year program to develop all of the new.
If I go by what the research people send me, so I mean, how serious are we talking here?
Well, you are talking very serious situation, and the precarious situation at Fukushima is, I mean, certainly it's bad enough what's inside the 2 reactor cores, 3 and 4, that had full meltdowns and blew their containment vessels, so they're leaking, out to the environment, the outside environment. But on top of that, see, most people don't realize that these nuclear reactor fuel doesn't last all that long. So every, couple years or so, they have to unload the reactor fuel rods and put fresh fuel rods in. Now, when they take those rods out, they're extremely hot physically and extremely hot radioactively. In fact, they're so hot that you can't get near them in a radiation suit. And they have these giant cranes that are built in part of the reactor mechanism as a way to load and unload these extremely radioactive fuel rods. So they have these giant cranes with mechanical linkages that can go down and reach inside a reactor and grip the fuel rods and pull them up and load them into this kind of like a little doughboy swimming pool on cables. And so they have this giant tank of water, and the rods are so radioactive that putting them in the water that soaks up the neutrons, and so the radioactivity is not so bad, so you can be around it like in a radiation suit when it's all buried in the water. And whereas you die even through the radiation suit if it didn't have that water around it. So then the crane lifts it up in this big bucket of water and moves over. It's like an industrial crane on rails. So it lifts them up, and then it slides sideways on rails. And then it goes to what's called a spent fuel pond pool, which is like a big giant swimming pool. It's 25 feet deep. And it takes these rods down and then unloads them with the mechanical linkages under the water and loads the rods onto specially designed racks so that they keep the rods from getting too close to each other and going critical. Even buried under 25 feet of water, they still have to be handled really carefully. And they can't be handled. They're so radioactive that electronic components fail near them, so they have to be all done with mechanical linkages, not little electronic robots, because it would zap not only would it kill people, it would also kill the electronic robots. So in Fukushima,